Hello everyone and welcome to the Writers Book Club podcast. I'm Michelle Barraclough and each month I take a deep dive with an author into the writing craft and process behind one of their books. My guest today is one of those incredibly accomplished people that make you wonder what you've been doing with your life. An ABC journalist for 35 years, Michael Brissenden has been posted all over the world where he honed his writing skills, and you'll hear how those skills have been useful when it comes to writing his 3 novels, especially when it comes to research and getting to the heart of a story really quickly. Today we're talking about Michael's latest novel, a crime thriller called Smoke. It's a terrific chat. Michael talks about why he set this novel in the US, how he uses dialogue to show emotion, the importance of putting a little poetry back into your writing, and he also gives a fabulous whiteboard tip. I think you're going to get a lot out of this chat. Let me tell you what Smoke is about. After a brutal wildfire tears through the town of Jasper in the Californian Sierras, a body is discovered in a shed. It looks like an open and shut case of accidental death until further investigation reveals that the victim was locked in from the outside. Years after leaving Jasper, Detective Alex Markov has been sent back under the shadow of an LAPD corruption investigation. She's convinced that the man, a family friend, was murdered opportunistically under the cover of the fire. As the smoke clears, Alex reveals a town corrupt to its core, but exposing that corruption could destroy her and the people she loves. Will she ignore the crookedness and deceit, or face the consequences of pursuing an inconvenient truth? This is a really multi-layered novel, and I think people expect that from crime novels these days, not just a simple whodunit, but a lot of complex characters and a really layered storyline. Now, before we get into the interview, let me tell you about Michael Brissenden. He was a journalist and foreign correspondent with the ABC for 35 years, posted to Moscow, Brussels and Washington. He worked in Canberra for many years in various roles, including as the political editor for ABC TV's 7:30 and as a reporter with the ABC's investigative television documentary program Four Corners. Through his reporting, Michael has covered bushfires both in Australia and overseas, including in California where Smoke is set. He has published 3 previous books, thriller novels, The List and Dead Letters, and his nonfiction book, which is called American Stories, Tales of Hope and Anger. I hope you enjoy my chat with Michael Brissenden. Michael, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Michelle. Thank you very much.
I absolutely love this book. I was just saying to you before, I just finished it and it was such a great tale. I couldn't put it down.
Good. That's the idea.
That is the idea. Yes, exactly. Tell me, where did the idea for this novel come from and how did those ideas coalesce, if you like, into the premise for a whole novel?
It's sort of a long story, but just sort of bear with me. My family has had a little house on the south coast of New South Wales for 60 years, more than 60 years, 70 years nearly. And when those big bushfires happened in Australia in 2020, this little village was the first place where that fire hit. And at that time, I was driving between Sydney and Canberra, and I was following the course of the fire on those little apps that everyone was using to track the fires. And I thought, at that moment, I just thought, wow, what if somebody actually used that moment to commit a crime, commit a murder? Like, you would think that the body was just part of the victim of the fire, but in fact, someone had taken that advantage of that particular moment where everybody was really traumatized and distracted and all sorts of things were going on and actually used it to their nefarious advantage. So that's where the initial idea came from. The story starts by finding a body in a shed, which is basically they think that this person is a victim of the fire, but actually it turns out the shed was locked from the outside. This person was locked in the shed and they were a victim of a murder. But then that was just the initial sort of starting point, the launch pad, if you like, for the story, because then once I started writing it, just all these other things started happening. And I started realizing that there was a whole lot of that this whole idea of a small place under pressure from a changing climate, under pressure from development, it wasn't just people using the fire at that point for their advantage, but whatever came after it was used for people were using for their advantage as well. And also this idea, I noticed, in the period after those fires, and I've covered fires in lots of places all over the world, including in California, which is eventually where I ended up setting this book. But what you notice about that is once a fire goes through a place, it strips all the canopy off the forest, and you see all these ravines and gullies and things in there that you would never otherwise see, and sometimes were meant to be hidden. Like people wanted them to stay hidden. Suddenly it's stripped away. And so you'll see buildings and tanks and burnt cars and God knows what else in there that you never knew were there. But it's also a metaphor for the community as a whole as well, because once the fire strips away the canopy of all the relationships in the town and all of those sorts of things, you start seeing things that you otherwise weren't supposed to see or wouldn't see. So anyway, that's sort of where it went. Once I got settled on that first thing, it just sort of, raged off in all sorts of directions.
Why did you then set it in the US?
Well, I wanted to write a story about a fictional town because I didn't want to be close to any of the people I was talking to. Yeah. I was talking to a lot of people on the South Coast, like I said, initially neighbours of ours down there. Everybody was really traumatised by that experience. And then when the fire just kept going and went for months and, I knew people in other parts of the coast where the fire hit, so a lot of those experiences, I was ringing people and sort of getting information about how towns were dealing with this and how they were dealing with the media influx and how they were dealing with all sorts of extra pressures that were put on after the fire had gone through. But I really didn't want it to be a recognisable place, and I didn't want it to be recognisable people that, that could be identifiable. Anyway, I started writing, and then it started to rain, and it just rained in New South Wales for about 18 months. But it started burning in California, and it started burning in places like Greece, a lot of places around the world that had very similar sort of environments. And I thought, well, this is not an Australian problem. This is increasingly a global problem. I had actually covered fires in California before as a correspondent, so I did know the territory. I didn't know all the details, and we'll probably get to that later. So I did go and do a research trip there. But I thought it would be a great challenge for a start to set it somewhere else. It would take me out of Australia into another environment. Obviously, America's a huge book market as well.
I was going to ask about that actually. Did that come into the thinking? Because
it wasn't really the driving force.
No,
but
doesn't hurt.
The more I started thinking about it, the more I started doing it, the more I thought, well, that's not a bad challenge, and it's not a bad opportunity to do that. So that's what I decided to do. And I think actually, it was a good thing to do, because not only did it take me out of here and away from everybody I knew, all of those issues that the book touches on, and it touches on quite a lot of issues, but, poverty, development pressure, healthcare, a whole lot of things like that. We all have those issues in Australia. There's
environment
stuff. But if you put it in America and you put it in California, all of those things are amplified so much. So the stakes just lifted, quite a lot immediately. And I think that certainly helped me in the writing, because the stakes were lifted, but also I was disconnected from it directly. So I thought it worked well.
Yeah, it did. There were moments where I kept thinking, because I was down on the South Coast on New Year's Eve. We were down at Mollymook, and so we got all caught up in that as well. And so that all felt very real, and I felt like it could have been set in Australia. Even the Indigenous issues, who does the land belong to and who knows the land best?
But isn't that interesting how that story translates so well, the Indigenous story? And I really wasn't sure about that, but when I did this research trip in California, and I eventually, having tried to get in touch with a whole lot of Native American tribes and whatever, and I wasn't getting anywhere, but I had a physical street address for a tribe outside of town, which was a town called Paradise, that I had covered the fire of some time before, and I knew that place had really been badly damaged. So I just drove up there, and sure enough, the place had burnt down. It wasn't there. And then I eventually found a number for them, and I got in touch with them and whatever. And their story was so similar to the story here. Like their forest management practices had basically been ignored
Yep.
For over 100 years. They had been prevented from actually carrying out their cultural practice, but they still did it anyway because they knew that they had to keep doing it for as long as they possibly could. The fires that the forests have now become sort of unmanageable because of that. And now they're coming back to them and saying, well, perhaps we need to listen to you about how how you did your cultural burns and what those practices were and all that sort of stuff. So all of those things are remarkably similar. And even down to the Indigenous communities on the south coast of New South Wales were pushed off their land. But when the logging industry really took hold in the early 20th century down there, many of them ended up in small sawmill towns, basically cutting the forests and, doing all of that sort of stuff. And then the national parks came in and the timber industry became very sort of corporatized. And then the sawmill jobs dried up as well, and they were left with nothing. And I was asking these guys in California, and they said that is exactly the same experience. It's just the parallels were incredible. They really were.
Yeah. Right down to the police corruption back in the 70s. One of the things that was a little bit different, and I know that we have our drug problems in regional areas as well, but would you say a little bit more pronounced in the States?
It is, especially it really, really is. And, there's, fentanyl for a start, which is a huge problem in America, really caused by the opioid crisis. So fentanyl's just out of control, but there's this new drug called tranq, which features in this book as well, which is just even more outrageous than fentanyl. It's just
destructive,
more destructive. And the drug issues in small towns everywhere is bad. But you put something like that in America, in California in particular, or sort of anywhere in America, really, it's pretty bad.
One of the things I really liked about your novel was that you didn't hold our hand too much. Like, you really make this work a little bit. And I love that, because instead of saying the Mackenzie brothers are Native American, I don't think you ever say that, but it comes through in what they talk about and what they say. And at some point they say, our people or something like that. And you're like, oh, okay. Our country, It's sort of like, okay.
I'm glad you said that, because I think that's something I've learned over time. And, particularly as journalists coming to fiction, we do have a tendency to try and over-explain everything. And you really have to be, I have to be very conscious of not doing that and really just trying to strip it back so that the reader does have to work and discover stuff for themselves and feels invested in actually discovering it.
Well, it was top of mind for me because I just interviewed Charlotte Wood recently, and her latest novel, Stoneyard Devotional, she was all about just stripping, not holding the reader's hand. And so I was quite conscious of that as I was reading your book. I'm like, oh, Michael's not really holding our hand here. It's really good.
It was a conscious decision to try and not over-explain something, because you don't want it to read like a lecture. You want people to actually enjoy the process of discovery and process of the read.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you later about what journalism has taught you about writing fiction. So let's go there now, because we've got Trent Dalton, for example. He's written nonfiction. Now he's written fiction. Quite a number of journalists have moved over to fiction. What do you think is the appeal, first of all, for you to write fiction? And then what do you bring from journalism? Because you've got decades and decades of journalism under your belt. What do you bring from journalism to that fiction process?
I think the appeal of it is it's a very liberating experience, because I have spent the best part of 40 years writing someone else's story. And you talk to somebody, you go somewhere, you describe where you are, you talk to the person, you're basically condensing their story into something that people want to read. You're providing some analysis yourself, obviously, but it's still, you have to follow the story. I mean, the story dictates where you go in the sense that there are parameters, very strong parameters about, you don't make it up for a start. You don't make up quotes. You don't make up this. You don't make up that. Whereas when you're writing fiction, the great thing about it, the beauty of it is, suddenly you just go, wow, how did I end up here? And isn't this fantastic? And perhaps I should go down that way, and that's a very liberating experience as someone who hasn't who spent, most of their life writing the other way. So it's a different sort of muscle. Having said that, I do think we bring to it a discipline. There's something about working to deadline and getting information out of people and immediately trying to describe where you are and what's happening that I think helps when you're doing, particularly when you're writing genre fiction, because it has to be believable. You people have to believe that they're in the world, right? The world. We're not writing fantasy. We're writing something that's happening in a real world situation. So the details have to be right without over explaining them, as we were talking about before. But people have to believe have to be immersed in the story and believe in the world. So I think we do bring a lot of that. And, in the research phase in particular, so for this book, the research phase, once I went to the US, was very much like doing a foreign correspondent or a Four Corners program. It was like, I knew who I had to speak to. I knew what I had to get. I knew how to get it. I knew, the right people to talk to who were going to get me to the right people. So I needed to have all of that stuff as background information for what was going to unfold in the story and to make sure that all the details and things like that were right, how the police operate, what the forests were, how they burn, all that sort of stuff you needed to have right, how newspapers operate in small towns in America and how important they are to the local fabric of the community, because there's a character in this who is a newspaper editor. So, all of those things, I think we bring a certain amount of research heft to something like this, which is good, probably cuts a few corners,
In the writing process, though, do you find yourself thinking, oh, actually, I don't need that information. All that research I've done, I need to cut that. That's too much. It's over-explaining.
Yeah, but it's better to have too much and cut than not have enough and have to sort of, scramble after it. I think it's easier. There's so many things that are small details that someone, if they're not described properly, somebody who knows about them will pick them up and go, oh, that would never happen. And that nothing puts you off reading a book more than actually picking holes in it, and so you want to try and minimize that as much as possible. I'm sure I haven't completely done it, but, as much as possible. And for instance, if you're writing a book like this set, with all this police corruption and internal affairs investigations and all that sort of stuff, and you set it in an Australian state, there's one police force. In California, there's like 76 different police jurisdictions. So how does that work, And I don't really explain it all in the book, but there are a few bits in there where there's a bit of dialogue backwards and forth between them about how she got there and all that sort of stuff, just to sort of back up the fact that it's not a straightforward process. And if someone was reading it who knows about that process, they would know, oh, okay, that's right, that's how this happened.
And I'm guessing you've got a few journo mates who read this book and they wouldn't hesitate to kind of
course,
pull you up.
Absolutely, yeah.
So tell me about how you work in terms of structuring this novel. Are you a plotter? Did you plan it all out? Or do you just start with the character or a place and then just hit the ground running and see where it goes? How did that look for you?
Well, I started with a couple of characters, and I did start with that initial premise, so I knew what was going to happen in the opening sections of the book. And I had a couple of characters that I'd sort of been working on, like her father, for instance, who is this Russian immigrant who ends up in California. I'd been working on a character like that in the background. He's a dog shooter and all this sort of stuff. And I wanted to have a female protagonist who was a female cop who was in her early 40s, who had sacrificed a lot for her career and got to the point where her career had been turned upside down. And all of those experiences that she articulates in that book about basically having to do the right thing and having to stand up for yourself, but not stand up too much, not be noticed too much, don't be shrill, but be assertive, all those sorts of things. Like, that's stuff that's sort of directly out of my experience of talking to cops everywhere, female cops, about how you work in a sort of essentially a pretty misogynistic environment and how you stand up for yourself. And what happens if you get to 43, you've sacrificed an awful lot to get to that point, and then the whole thing turns to crap and you're, the subject of an internal affairs investigation. So that was sort of broadly the starting point. But I didn't really know. I don't plot as such. I like to say I plot in 90,000 words, like I think people plot differently. Some people like to, I whiteboard stuff all the time. So there'll be scenes I'll know I want to put in. There'll be characters that I know are going to have find conflict at some point within the story. In this one, there's the good cops and the bad cops, and how they integrate and operate, and how or you think but you don't know which ones are what. So all of that, I knew I wanted to put all of those elements in the story. I knew I wanted to put a story about the mother and the nursing home, because I wanted that was very much a direct experience of my own mother. And at the time when I was writing it, I was dealing with exactly those things with my mother. Not that the nursing home she was in was under any threat from development, which this one is in this book, but that whole experience of dealing with aged care and stuff I wanted to put in. So there were lots of things I wanted to do. I just wasn't quite sure how I was going to make it all work until I started doing it.
There are a lot of characters. There are a lot of issues. I take my hat off to you, because I can imagine the whiteboard may have gotten quite a workout at various stages.
But what I do is do the whiteboard, then I'll fill it up, then I'll take a photograph of the whiteboard, and I'll rub it clean and start again. So I know I can always go back to the photograph. Did
you always know that you were going to start in the place where you started?
Yes. I knew how it would start. I had that image of Alex Markov driving over the bridge in the town the day after the fire, and how confronting that was, and what was happening on the ground, and the whole atmospherics of all of that. I definitely had all of that. So I did know how it was going to start. Didn't really know what was going to happen much after that. I sort of, like I said, I knew there were points I wanted to hit.
And did you know the ending? It's a very satisfying ending.
Yeah, I didn't know that final chapter, and I didn't really see the big twist reveal. I knew there was a twist, but didn't quite know how I was going to get to it. And didn't really see that until I was, 2/3 of the way through, and then I knew that's how that was going to happen. So initially, the book just sort of ended. After that, there's that twist and reveal, and then it just sort of ended. And in the editing process, we were sort of talking about it. It's like, well, it just can't. It's got to resolve somehow. You got to resolve her and her position and what happened. And, as it happened, I was starting writing the next book, and I had that opening scene of the next book, which was her some time after that, confronting the fact that there were still issues to deal with. And actually, that was the best way to end this book, because that way you do get some sort of resolution, without spoiling it too much, that things have happened, but they haven't really happened.
I didn't know how you were going to get her out of it, quite frankly. It was very, very tense towards the end. And I didn't see that coming. It was very clever. Very well done. And does that mean we're getting another Alex Markov?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, hope so.
When it flows from your brain and onto the whiteboard.
That's right.
So we just talked about the opening there. Now might be a good time to have a little look at that. Would you mind reading just the first part of it, just so listeners can get a bit of an idea?
So this is the day after the fire. Alex Markov drove slowly. The air outside, thick and grey, the colour of old bones. Here and there, small groups of people appeared by the side of the road. Families, neighbours, heads bowed, kicking the dirt and pushing through the hot rubble with rakes and shovels, watching the rising smoke carry off their lives. The fire had picked off buildings at random, leaving some reduced to nothing more than a twisted pile of tin and bricks. Cars rested on tireless rims and metal frames, the skeletal innards of furniture, beds and couches poking out at angles from the thick grey ash. On a corner, a father and his young son were standing in the middle of a block that had been, until yesterday, a clapboard and iron cottage that had survived more than 100 summers. On the road beside them, the remains of a blackened wheelchair lay in the gutter. She drove on over the bridge that split the little town of Big Jasper in two. Somehow the old two-storey Jasper Hotel was still standing. A flag, torn and half burnt, hung off the awning. All the stars, only half the stripes. A sign spray-painted on cardboard had been tacked up onto the wall. Thank you Free beer for firefighters after 6. A couple she didn't recognise was standing out by the front door, looking at a large cork pinboard. She stopped the car, opened the door, felt the malevolent sting of the smoke tear at her lungs. The couple looked up as she approached, their eyes hollow with lack of sleep and exhaustion. They were both dressed in loose cotton clothes, stained black and brown with charcoal and dirt. The man was big, wide shoulders, all muscle, a shaved head and a biker beard. The woman was short and fine, looked like she could break in a breeze. She had soot and burnt plastic stuck to her dreadlocks. They said nothing as Alex joined them, continued scouring the dozens of little messages scribbled on coloured post-it notes that had already started to appear on the board. Andrew and Romney Grenfell and kids, all okay. Jenny Green and family, all safe. Palestine Road is open. Brenda and Andrew, all good. Animal burials and help, called Django. Nothing had been put in place yet. No relief centre, no emergency housing, no food. It would come. Across from the hotel, one of the 2 merchant buildings that had once made a grand opening statement on the main street had fallen in on itself. The other half of the pier was still standing, brick and timber, wide verandas on the second level, rooms behind mostly empty. The plastic 4th of July decorations still hanging off the street poles out the front had melted and shrunk. Underneath them, a couple of shop fronts on the street level, a real estate office and the old general store that had been closed for years. One of the big glass windows had blown in, but the peeling signs on the awning advertising familiar newspaper mastheads still hung on. The Sacramento Bee, the San Francisco Chronicle, the LA Times, the Bantam Valley Guardian. They were faded, but not gone yet. Vita had told her years ago that there were plans to turn the old store into a cafe. It never happened. The same story. Big Jasper was always just about to be discovered. Someone always had plans.
Brilliant. Thank you. I love that section, that opening, because it's a perfect example of how you set the reader in time and place. And you do that wonderful thing of starting big and then zooming in, because straight after that, there's dialogue and Alex starts, speaking to people and what have you. So it's terrific the way you do that. Also, when you mentioned about the flag, that she could see the flag, all the stars, half the stripes, that's just such a great example of what we were talking about before, where you don't give us like, we are in America, that's the American flag. So it's making the reader work for that bit of information. Right, little light bulb goes on and you feel quite satisfied as a reader when you figure that out. And then also your attention to detail, and I guess this comes from your so many years of writing as well. The woman who has soot and bits of plastic in her dreadlocks. It's not just soot in her hair, just going to that level of detail. It just makes a really rich reading experience, I think.
I think, the other thing that I've learned over time is sometimes you've got to put poetry back into things.
Yes.
Like I spent a lot of time initially, years ago when I first started to write fiction. One of my favourite writers is Elmore Leonard, and the early Elmore Leonard I really like. And then I read this thing that he'd written about how to write, and his whole thing is, like stripping out stuff that's unnecessary, take it all out, take all that stuff out. So for years I sort of did that, and then I just thought at some point, eventually if you take too much out, you end up with a play, right? You just have dialogue because everything else is superfluous, right? And so then I thought, no, actually, you've got to really, for me, I've really got to stuff some poetry back in there because, my natural tendency is not to do that. And so sometimes I'll go back and really try and work on a description or a scene or something to put stuff back in. And again, not doing it in a way that gives too much, that tells too much, but just that colour and that descriptive detail is sometimes really important.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I think it's just that fine balancing act, isn't it? Not telling too much, but the telling that you do in a really beautiful way that creates that specificity, I suppose, that creates that really rich reading experience. And that's what I'm always after as a reader.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's, it's fun to write too.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did your writing day look with smoke. Are you still working, as a journo? How does your
Uh,
writing day look, and how do you split it all up and balance it all?
so I started writing this after I left. I left the ABC. It's now 3 years since I left the ABC. So I left thinking I was going to devote myself to writing, which is what I did basically. So, but my writing regime, when I'm doing it, which I did pretty comprehensively. I was dedicated to doing it for quite a long time with this book without a break. So it probably took me about 8 months to write the first draft, start to finish, and that included a sort of 3-week research trip to California. But that was just the first draft, Then I did have to go back and do a lot of. But for me, getting the story down is really important. All those things about how it was going to resolve and the twists and all that sort of stuff, that came in the first draft. But that's important for me to get all that down, and then I can then go back and then sort of think about, putting some more poetry back in it, or fleshing out a character a bit earlier so that the reader's a bit more invested in it, or those sorts of things. So I work in the mornings. I get up pretty early. I work in the mornings till lunchtime, and then I don't work in the afternoon.
So your dialogue is also something that really stands out, I think. Tell me what you think the secret to good dialogue is and getting that on the page.
I love dialogue. I think dialogue is really, really important as a driver of narrative. And it has to be as natural as possible. It has to be the way people speak without actually being the way people speak. You can say so much in dialogue about the relationship between characters, how they respond to each other, whether they like each other. If they joke together in a way, that's a really great way of bringing two characters empathetically together because they share something. Whether they get upset, how they get upset with each other. Like, I think the relationship in this book between Alex and Mackenzie is a really important relationship. And I actually think it's one of the relationships that works really well in the book because they are very different, but they become very close through a shared sort of adversity or a shared understanding of being an outsider. And often the way that I think that exhibits itself in the book is through dialogue because, they're talking about, how they don't really fit in and, and how they expect each other to back each other up and all that sort of thing.
Their relationship, they're able to josh each other as well, like almost like siblings, which was delightful.
Right. And so you don't really need to say much more about their relationship other than the way they talk to each other, really. So dialogue is important. I don't know. I've never really had trouble writing dialogue. Dialogue is, something that sort of comes pretty naturally to me, I think.
Do you talk it out?
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. Sometimes it's worth reading stuff out, But I think, also I do, and maybe this is so many years in television, I do think very visually too. And so if you watch great drama, it's all dialogue, right? And then what's sort of happening behind the dialogue, what the camera's seeing, what you're not seeing, all that stuff. But it's the dialogue sort of driving it. So, the best of that, something like The Wire or the dialogue and things like that is just superb. And, I'm not suggesting I'm anywhere close to that, but I do think it's just so natural, and that's what makes great dialogue.
Yeah. Even one of the things I noticed is sometimes the characters, especially when Alex is talking to her superiors or the other blokes in the police station, the ones that she doesn't get along with that well and doesn't want to give too much to, she almost speaks in fragments, like she'll drop the conjunctions and she'll sort of really clip her tone.
That is how people, particularly in sort of stressful situations or, when they don't like somebody, they don't really want to engage, or they just want to say what they need to say and nothing more,
Yeah.
And so much, doesn't it?
One of the things that the dialogue does with your characters adds those layers. Because at first, Alex comes across as she is quite clipped and she's quite guarded. But then she does open up to Aubrey and she does open up to Mackenzie, and we get to see this other side of her. And when she's dealing with her sister-in-law and her mother, and God, there's so many characters, Michael. But we get to see these different sides of Alex, and that made me root for her. It gave me that emotionality that I needed to really connect with her as a character. What else do you think is really important in terms of making sure that the reader can connect with a character?
I'm pleased you say that, because she is a complicated character. She's a complicated individual, and the best characters are like that, I think. And she has a big backstory, which is sort of revealed. It's dripped out a bit at the start. It's important for me that her character is complicated, that she is a complicated person, that there's a whole lot you can discover about her as you go through the book that makes you want to root for her, that makes you want to follow her, that, she's not all good, but she's not bad. She's had a lot of hurdles to overcome, and she's sort of done it in a way that's been quite, you'd be quite proud if that was someone you knew who'd done those things, although she's made some very bad choices.
To have a flawed character also makes them relatable, doesn't it?
She's had to come to terms with those choices. So, yeah, she's a complicated character, but her whole family's complicated. Her father's a really
They really are.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of complicated characters. Yeah. Not too many, I hope. I mean, I think, if there's a criticism you could make of it, it's probably that there may be too many characters, particularly at the start. But I think once you get into the book, like those characters, you tend to focus in on the characters that are really important, and their complications become very important to the story.
Was that something that came up in the editing process at all? Like, how did that all roll out for you?
Yeah. It did a bit. I did have to strip a bit of the stuff out at the beginning because it was a bit complicated. There were a bit too much going on, a few too many characters, which was, that was the right call. I did have to go back and put in a bit more about some of the characters as well to flesh them out a bit more, so that you knew them better. For instance, Rain Mackenzie's brother, we needed to know more about him earlier in the story because we needed to be invested in him when what happened to him happens.
Thanks for that. I liked him.
Yeah, he's a good character. I mean, but we needed to like him. You needed to like him.
We did.
Because that gave it more, impact later on in the story. So those sorts of things. That's why great editing, a great editor will do things like, will say to you, we need to invest. They're not writing the story for you. They're just telling you, we need to, you need to make this work. So think about how you're going to do that, And
how did you find the editing process this time around with this book?
I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really, really positive. Editing, sometimes people are afraid of editing. I always tell writers, just don't be afraid of editing. And also sometimes editors are afraid to be frank with their writers. And I always say to them, you haven't
bring it on.
Yeah, you haven't been through a Four Corners editing experience. It's not much you can do to me that's going to, as long as we're all working to make this a better product, as long as we're all working constructively, no one wants negative, horrible editing, but good editing is not that. It is constructive. But sometimes it can be hard work. Sometimes you really do have to go, you're right. I need to go back and, work on that more. And that's good.
Were there any conventions of the crime or police procedural genres that you feel you need to pick as you go through, or do you just...
Well, apart from the fact that there's a dead body, pretty close to the front of the book, I think that's important. I mean, these things need to be page turners, right? So you need to be able to get to the end of a chapter and make someone not want to turn the light off and go to sleep, keep going, keep reading. You want to keep reading. So it's important for me to make the story propulsive in a way that, you want to keep pushing forward. You always want to keep pushing forward, but you want to hold things back too. You can't, so you've got to drop little things that will become important later on.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things are important in crime novels because people like to have the challenge of trying to figure it out. You don't want to let them do it, but you want to give them an opportunity to think they can do it. You need to put a few clues in without putting too many in.
Is it a science or an art, Michael? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it just comes through. I think it comes through experience, actually.
Yeah.
Reading a lot. I don't think you consciously do it. Sometimes you might go back and consciously pull stuff out because there's too much information there. Or you might go back and think, well, I actually just need to put a bit more of that person in there because that person's going to become much more important later. So, we need to do that. But, I think we pick up an awful lot by reading about how we structure things without actually, having to do a degree in how to structure a novel. We instinctively know if you read a lot, you instinctively, there's a lot of instinct there about how you pace things.
Who are your go-to reads in this genre?
Peter Temple is probably one of the most accessible and powerful crime writers we've seen in this country.
Also very good at making those sentences beautiful.
Exactly. Great writing, beautiful writing. Just because it's a crime novel doesn't mean it's not, beautiful writing. There's so many people who write beautifully in the genre. Who else? Well, Elmore Leonard, as I say, a lot of those old American writers who I sort of grew up on. Don Winslow, who's given a good quote for the book, he's one of I think he, to me, does sort of this modern American sort of political crime thing, like his series on the border, the Cartel Wars, is probably one of the most amazing bits of, it's almost journalism, but it's not. It's just amazing fiction, but there's so much in there. There's so much that he takes that's real. That's there's so much research in there that doesn't read like research. That is a masterclass in how to do that sort of stuff.
So good. And that must have been a very nice day when the Don Winslow quote fell into your inbox.
Yeah, it's pretty.
How did that come about?
Oh, it's pretty amazing. Yeah. I just got in touch with him on Twitter, actually. And, he's got a big Twitter following.
Don't be afraid to ask.
Don't be afraid to ask. Exactly.
That's fabulous. Michael, I would like to ask you if there's one big tip that you would share with aspiring writers, what do you think that would be?
I think there are so many answers to that. One is read a lot, particularly into the genre that you're in, read a lot of the stuff that you want to write. That's really important. Get an idea of what other people are doing. Actually sit down and write. Like, you can't edit an empty page. You actually have to put one word after another. A book is like climbing a mountain. It's one word after another until you get to 95, 100,000 words, and then you've got to go back and sort of go through it and start again. So I think that all of that is really important. And also I think character is really, really important. And often start with character. Don't start with plot, start with character, because people follow a character through all sorts of things. They'll follow great characters. And often plot comes as you're going. The muse doesn't come if you're not sitting down at your keyboard.
That's really great advice. Now, you're obviously writing. Have you got some events coming up that people could come and see you at?
Lots of events coming up. So I'll be in regional Victoria for most of that first 2 weeks of July, and there's a lot of events there. I think there's Geelong, there's Barwon Heads, there's Warrnambool, there's Wangaratta, there's a whole lot of places. That's all on, if you go to the website, you'll find that. Then after that, there's the Kiama Writers Festival.
Yes. And are you coming up to the Northern Beaches of Sydney?
Then there's the Northern Beaches Festival.
Oh, I'll get to see you there.
Then there's the Bad Crime Writing Festival.
Crime Writers, yep.
They'll be doing something at Concord Library as well, sometime in August. And there's Goulburn as well on the same week that the Bad Crime Writers Festival on, the Saturday of that week. There's a big event in Goulburn as well. So there's a lot coming up.
Yeah, the Goulburn Library does some amazing events with crime writers, don't they?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So this one, there'll be a lot of us there. I think Tim Ailiff, there's quite a few people going to go to that. But, people should go to the Bad Crime Writer Festival in Sydney. That is good. There's a lot of great stuff there that goes, I think there's three or 4 days from the 11th to the 14th of September.
Yeah, all the crime lovers get along to that. Michael, thank you so much for your time today. I've loved the chat. I loved the book. Everyone should go and read it. And I look forward to catching you at the Northern Beaches Readers Festival in September.
Yes, look forward to that. That should be fun. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks.
There you go, Michael Brissenden. I hope you got a lot out of that chat. I've added a link to Michael's upcoming events if you'd like to get along and see him in person and maybe get a copy of Smoke and get it signed by Michael. Next up on the podcast is someone I've been wanting to have on for ages, the lovely, the wonderful Petronella McGovern. She's not only a terrific writer, she's an absolute gem in the Australian writing community. She's always championing other authors' books and lending an ear to other writing friends, including me. As a writer, Petronella is fascinated by what makes people tick, the lies we tell and the secrets we keep. Leanne Moriarty says she is one of her favourite Australian authors. Petronella consistently delivers smart, twisty page-turners guaranteed to keep readers coming back for more. And, you know, Leanne Moriarty, I think she knows what she's talking about when it comes to twisty page-turners. Petronella is the best-selling author of 6 Minutes, The Good Teacher, The Liars, and the novel we're going to be discussing, her brand new one, The Last Trace. Let me tell you what it's about. What if you're scared you committed a crime but can't remember? Family. It means everything to Sheridan. She's missed having her brother around. And at last, Lockie is back in Australia and Sheridan can't wait to spend Easter holidays all together in the mountains with their kids. But on Good Friday, something devastating happens that rips their two families apart, and now she can't imagine ever forgiving him. Lockie knows he's not coping, but his sister doesn't have the full story, and terrifyingly, nor does he. There are some critical gaps in his memory. How is he connected to a missing woman, a hit and run, and a request for DNA? To untangle the truth, Lockie must decide who he can trust. His sister, his friends, himself. The Last Trace is a gripping thriller about siblings and secrets and the traces we can never erase. Oh my gosh, it sounds wonderful, doesn't it? The Last Trace is out tomorrow, the 2nd of July, 2024, in all the usual bookstores. So go and grab a copy, have a read, and send me your writing questions for Petronella, either via DM on Instagram or Facebook, or there's a form on the website at writersbookclubpodcast.com that you can fill in. And remember, everyone who asks a question gets a little shout out on the podcast and a link to you in the show notes. So get those questions over to me by about the 20th of July so I can ask Petronella your question in the interview. And thanks to the good folk at Allen & Unwin, I have a copy of The Last Trace to give away. All you have to do is sign up to my newsletter. And don't worry if you're already a subscriber, everybody is in the draw. And while you're at it, go and give Petronella a follow on Instagram and Facebook as well. Okay, lovely listeners, that's it for this month. As always, I'm recording on the beautiful unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I'm lucky enough to live and work. I'll catch you next month. Until then, happy writing.